Let's talk a little bit about Silicon Valley first. How does Silicon Valley and these tech companies measure up to other sectors?
Yeah, it's a great place to jump in, Sherry, because what we're finding in Silicon Valley is that there's still a lag going on. It's a little bit of a surprise given the level of innovation and progressiveness that are often associated with the technology sector. But nonetheless, there are reasons for it, and it's lagging, and I think people are disappointed.
A lot of people would say the excuse for this is that there aren't qualified candidates out there to fill those positions. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's balderdash, to use an old school expression. In fact, 90% of our placements at Boardspan have resulted in a diverse candidate, either women, people of color, or frankly, both is not that uncommon either. I think the bigger problem really is people have to get out of their own networks and out of their own pools, and that's why you hear that common complaint that there just aren't enough good candidates. Well, in fact, there are plenty of good candidates if you know where to look.
On some good news, Abby, I should point out that Australia has managed to maintain the 30% target that was hit at the end of last year in terms of representation of female candidates on boards of companies listed here in Australia. Is it particularly difficult in the tech sector?
Yeah, I think it's difficult if you have a really narrow definition, and that's one of the things that we often talk with our clients about, which is thinking a little bit about, first and foremost, what problem are you trying to solve? And I do want to interrupt myself and make one point, which is there are very few candidates who want to be on a board because they're checking that diversity box, and it's not good for the board, it's not good for the company. So in fact, you really want to focus on what is the business problem we're trying to solve. And that's the first question any company should ask. And then say, well, how do you come up with a solution that doesn't necessarily have to fall into the same old type of pattern of, well, we want a CEO or a CFO to check that box for us. And I think the more that organizations push themselves to think about what problems they're trying to solve, the more they're going to realize, especially in technology, that there are a lot of different ways to solve that problem. And lo and behold, there is a much broader set of candidates who happen to be diverse.
I think, going to what Sherry was saying earlier about the criticism that there just aren't enough qualified female candidates for these roles. I mean, there is a point, right? Because globally, you look at female CEOs, I think it's still under 5%. Female CFOs is still under 15%, I think under 13%. So there is just a lack of female representation in C-suite overall. So what needs to happen? Because clearly gender parity is not something that will just happen progressively.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm glad you asked that, because when we talk about boards and the importance of having diverse boards, that certainly is one way to help and sort of what we, pulling people up from the top of the organization. But I'm a big believer that we also have to make sure that we're looking at it at the middle and the bottom of the organization. Because the reality is most people find their way to the C-suite by having grown up in a company or having grown up in a competitor and making the switch over. And the best way for us to continue to make sure there's diversity in those top jobs is to make sure there's diversity in the bottom. As a board member, I would really like to see the companies that I work with make sure that they're thinking about diversity at all levels in the organization, because that's the long-term healthy plan. And then you're going to see a much more parity across the organization when you do that.
Abby, California had its own initiative for women on board, right? The SB 826. Tell us about it, and how did that turn out?
Yeah, so SB 826 was a bill that Hannah Beth Jackson, one of our lawmakers, really sponsored. It got signed by Governor Brown in 2018, and the first year that it was really put into effect was this past year of 2019. It required every California public company to have at least one woman on the board. And there's 500 some odd public companies in California, and about 90% got there. So that was really good progress. I mean, that law had the desired effect. For 2021, so 2 years from now, the bar goes up. And depending upon the size of the board, they're going to have 2 or 3 diverse women on boards. And that is just putting a lot more pressure, because there are about 1,000 board members that are going to be needed to fill those spots in the next 2 years.
How do you address some of the criticism, like the validity, the sense of tokenism, and so forth, around those initiatives?
Yeah, there's definitely some pushback on it, and I'll just declare myself a capitalist at heart, just to say, had the system worked itself and had free markets taken care of this problem, I think we'd all have been happier. But I think because people were left to their own devices and didn't take it as seriously, we now find ourselves with this litigation. And the best thing to do is respond to it. As far as the pushback, there are already some groups out there saying, gee, it's affirmative action in all the wrong ways, not the right ways. It's not constitutional. So we're seeing some legal pushback. Meanwhile, the results are in. 90% of the companies are in compliance. And I think most importantly, the awareness, what is the value of diversity, why is diversity a good thing, has gotten way higher up on the boardroom narrative. And that's the progress that we were looking for.